This poor girl discovers a way to save the life of a wealthy 6-year-old girl's millionaire father who is on the brink of death. But upon revealing this to the rich girl, something terrible happens 2 days later. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The sun hadn't yet risen when Isabella woke up to the sound of her mother's raspy cough. The small wooden shack where they lived barely protected them from the cold that seeped in through the cracks in the rotten boards. The 6-year-old girl got up from the torn mattress she shared with her mother and, with trembling hands, tried to light the candle they kept for emergencies. "Mom, are you okay?" Isabella asked, her childish voice filled with worry. Carol, her mother, continued coughing, her thin body shaking violently. When she finally managed to breathe, she looked at her daughter with sunken, feverish eyes. "I'm fine, honey. I just need to rest a little," Carol replied, but her weak voice betrayed her words. Isabella knew it wasn't true. Her mother was getting worse every day. The shack where they lived was in a forgotten area of the city, between abandoned buildings and empty lots. It was a tiny room, with walls that let in the rain and a roof that threatened to collapse. The few belongings they had, some old clothes, a dented pan, and a worn blanket, were piled in a corner. When the sun finally rose, Isabella was already on the street, as she did every day. Her bare feet knew every stone on the way to downtown. The dress, 3 sizes too big for her frail body, dragged on the ground as she walked. Her dark hair, tangled and dirty, fell over her big, sad eyes. "Ma'am, can you help me with some change?" she asked each person who passed by. Most pretended not to see the small, dirty figure holding out her hand. Some quickened their pace, others crossed the street. Isabella was used to the rejection, but that didn't make it any easier to see people looking away as if she were invisible. On the other side of the city, in an imposing mansion in the wealthiest neighborhood, Eleanor woke up in her king-size bed, surrounded by teddy bears and expensive dolls. The pink room was bigger than many apartments, with a balcony overlooking a perfect garden. The 6-year-old girl stretched languidly, while Mary, the housekeeper, came in to help her get dressed. "Good morning, sweetie," Mary smiled, but her eyes were worried. "Your father didn't have a good night." Eleanor sat up in bed immediately, all laziness disappearing. "What happened to Daddy? He had a high fever again." "Your mother is with him in the room. The doctor is already on his way," Mary explained, while choosing a dress from the huge wardrobe. In the master bedroom of the mansion, Arthur was lying in the king-size bed, his usually rosy face now pale as wax. Michelle, his wife, paced back and forth, her high heels clicking nervously on the marble floor. "You need to eat something, Arthur," she insisted, her voice tense. "You can't go on like this." Arthur tried to answer, but was interrupted by another coughing fit. His body, once strong and imposing, now seemed fragile and diminished against the feather pillows. The mysterious illness that had afflicted him for months was rapidly consuming his strength, and none of the doctors consulted could discover the cause. Back on the streets downtown, Isabella continued her daily pilgrimage. The midday sun beat down on her already sunburned skin, but she couldn't stop. She needed to get money to buy the medicine her mother needed. It was when she reached the door of a pharmacy that something caught her attention. 2 men were talking in low voices, but not so low that Isabella couldn't hear. "Did you hear about Arthur? That businessman from the Campbell Group?" said one of them, adjusting his expensive suit. "They say he's at death's door." "I heard," replied the other. "But wasn't he being treated by that famous doctor? The one they say works miracles." "Exactly. And you know what else? Since he started treatment with that so-called doctor, he's only gotten worse." Isabella felt her heart clench. The men's words reminded her of something her mother had mentioned months ago, before she got so sick. Carol had been approached by a man who claimed to be a doctor, promising a cure for her illness. He had given her some medicine, but after she started taking it, her health deteriorated rapidly. The girl stood still, her small body trembling not from cold anymore, but from a terrible realization. Could the same thing be happening to the businessman? Was he being deceived as her mother had been? The men walked away, leaving Isabella alone with her turbulent thoughts. She knew she needed to do something, but what? How could a street girl help a rich man she didn't even know? That night, when she returned to the shack, she found her mother sleeping restlessly. Carol was hotter than usual. The fever had returned with a vengeance. Isabella soaked a piece of cloth in the water they kept in a bucket and placed it on her mother's forehead, as she had learned to do. While taking care of Carol, her mind kept thinking about what she had heard. If that doctor was really doing something wrong, other people could die as her mother was dying. She needed to try to stop it. She made a decision. Tomorrow, she would look for the businessman's house. She didn't know exactly where it was, but she had heard about the Campbell mansion. Everyone in town knew it. It would be difficult to get there, and even more difficult to talk to someone, but she needed to try. What Isabella didn't know was that her decision would change not only the businessman's life, but also her own, in ways she could never have imagined. And that fate was about to intertwine her story with that of a girl who, despite living only a few miles away, inhabited a world completely different from hers. The next morning, Carol could barely get up. The fever had increased during the night, and her body trembled uncontrollably under the thin blanket. Isabella felt despair growing in her chest as she watched her mother cough non-stop. "Mum, I'm going to get help," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I promise I'll be right back." Carol tried to answer, but another coughing fit stopped her. Isabella kissed her mother's hot forehead and left the shack with a heavy heart. Normally, she would stay to take care of Carol, but today she had an important mission. If she could warn the businessman about the fake doctor, perhaps she could prevent another family from suffering like hers. The way to the wealthy neighborhood was long. Isabella walked for hours, her bare feet hurt by the stones and the hot asphalt. As she went on, the streets became wider and cleaner, the houses more beautiful. Some people looked at her with suspicion. Others called security guards when they saw her approaching. Finally, after much asking and searching, Isabella arrived. At the street where the Campbell mansion was located, the place was even more impressive than she had imagined. A high wall surrounded the property, with security cameras in every corner. The main gate was made of wrought iron, painted gold, and two burly security guards stood watch. Isabella approached timidly. "Please, I need to speak with the owner of the house," she said, her voice small in the face of the place's grandeur. The security guards didn't even bother to look at her properly. "Get out of here, kid." "We don't want beggars," one of them said, waving her away with his hand. "But it's important," Isabella insisted. "It's about his health. Please." "I told you to leave." The security guard took a step toward her menacingly. "Don't make me call the police." Isabella backed away, but she didn't give up. She hid behind a tree across the street, watching the house's activity. She saw when a luxurious car left through the gates, probably taking someone from the family. Then she saw when an elegant woman arrived, being received with reverence by the security guards. The hours passed, and the sun began to set. Isabella was hungry and thirsty, worried about her mother, but she couldn't leave yet. It was then that she saw through the bars of the gate a girl her age playing in the garden. It must be Eleanor, the businessman's daughter. Gathering all her courage, Isabella approached the gate again. "Hey!" she called in a low voice, so as not to attract the attention of the security guards. "Hey, girl!" Eleanor looked in her direction, curious. She was wearing a light blue dress that looked like a princess's, and her blonde hair was perfectly arranged in two braids. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, approaching the gate. "My name is Isabella. I really need to talk to your father," she whispered, looking nervously at the security guards who, fortunately, were distracted talking to each other. "Why?" Eleanor tilted her head, studying the dirty, ragged girl on the other side of the gate. "It's important. It's about his illness. I know something that can help," Isabella explained, her heart pounding. Eleanor hesitated. She knew she shouldn't talk to strangers, much less let them in, but there was something in Isabella's desperate look that touched her. Besides, her father was so sick. What if this girl really knew something that could help him? "Wait here," Eleanor said, and ran into the house. Isabella waited, tense, praying that the rich girl wouldn't call the security guards. A few minutes later, Eleanor returned with a determined look on her face. "Come on," she whispered, pointing to a small side gate half hidden among the plants. "I know how to get in there without anyone seeing us." Carefully, so as not to make noise, Eleanor unlocked the gate and pulled Isabella inside. The Kaikis garden was huge, with flowers of all kinds and a crystal-clear water fountain in the center. To Isabella, it seemed like a dream. The girls sneaked through the flower beds until they reached a side door of the mansion. Eleanor led Isabella through luxurious corridors with huge paintings on the walls and soft carpets underfoot. Isabella had never seen so much luxury in her life, but she didn't have time to admire it. She needed to find Eleanor's father before anyone discovered her. When they reached the second floor, they heard loud voices coming from one of the rooms. Eleanor signaled for Isabella to be quiet, and they approached slowly. "I can't stand to see you wasting away like this anymore." It was a woman's voice, probably Eleanor's mother. "That doctor said you would get better, but you're only getting worse. Maybe we should look for another professional." "Michelle." "Please," responded a male voice, weak and punctuated by coughs. "Dr. Richards is highly respected. He assured me the treatment takes time." "Time is what we don't have, Arthur. Look at you. You can barely get out of bed." Isabella felt her heart race when she heard the doctor's name. It was the same one who had deceived her mother. Before she could think better, she took a step forward, becoming visible in the doorway. Michelle, who was pacing nervously back and forth, stopped abruptly when she saw the dirty girl standing in the entrance. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. "Mom, wait!" Eleanor came out from behind Isabella. "I let her in. She said she knows something about Daddy's illness." "What? Eleanor, how could you do this?" Michelle advanced towards the girls. "This girl is obviously a beggar. She probably came in to steal." "No, ma'am, please." Isabella took a step back, frightened by the fury in the woman's eyes. "I just want to help. That doctor, Dr. Richards, he's a liar. How dare you?" Michelle grabbed Isabella's arm tightly. "Guards! Guards!" "No, Mom, please!" Eleanor started to cry, clinging to her mother's skirt. "Let her talk." "Michelle." Arthur's weak voice sounded from the bed. "What's going on?" But before anyone could answer, two burly security guards rushed into the room. In seconds, Isabella was dragged outside, desperately trying to make herself heard. "Please, he's poisoning people. He did it to my mother. The medicines are fake," she shouted, but her words were lost in the confusion. The guards took her to the main gate and threw her unceremoniously onto the sidewalk. Isabella fell, scraping her knees and hands on the asphalt. Tears of pain and frustration streamed down her dirty face. "If you show up here again, we'll call the police," one of the guards threatened, before going back inside. Isabella lay there, fallen on the sidewalk, her small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The sun was already setting, and she still needed to go home to her sick mother. She had failed in her mission. No one had listened to her. No one had believed her. Inside the mansion, Eleanor cried copiously while her mother scolded her harshly. "Never do that again. Do you have any idea of the danger you were in, letting a stranger in? What if she was a criminal?" "But Mom, she seemed to be telling the truth," Eleanor sobbed. "What if she really knows something that can help Daddy? Don't be naive, Eleanor. She just wanted money, like all those beggars. Now go to your room and don't leave until I tell you to." As she climbed the stairs, still crying, Eleanor looked out the window and saw Isabella getting up with difficulty, limping as she began her long walk back. Something in her heart told her she had made a mistake, letting the girl be expelled like that. In bed, Arthur had another violent coughing fit. Michelle rushed to help him, placing another dose of the medicine prescribed by Dr. Richards on his lips, the same medicine that, without them knowing, was slowly poisoning him. Isabella walked through the dark city with a heavy heart. When she finally arrived at the shack, she found her mother burning with fever, delirious. She soaked the cloth with water again and placed it on her forehead, the tears now running freely down her face. "Forgive me, Mom," she whispered, lying down next to Carol. "I tried to do something good today, but no one wanted to listen to me. No one ever wants to listen to people like us." What Isabella didn't know was that her words had planted a seed of doubt in Eleanor's heart. A seed that, in the coming days, would grow and change the destiny of everyone involved in ways that no one could predict. The days that followed were a nightmare for Isabella. Her mother's condition worsened rapidly, and she had no money to buy even the most basic medicines. Carol could barely swallow water, and her breathing was becoming increasingly difficult, a constant wheeze that haunted the girl's dreams. To make matters worse, the injuries from the fall at the Campbell mansion had become inflamed. Her knees burned, and she limped when she walked, which made her job of begging on the streets even harder. People seemed even more willing to ignore her now that she could barely move. On a particularly cold morning, Isabella woke up with her mother calling for her in the midst of a feverish delirium. "Elizabeth, Elizabeth, my sister, don't let him do it," Carol murmured, her glazed eyes fixed on the precarious ceiling of the shack. "Mom, it's me, Isabella," she replied, holding her mother's hot, trembling hand. "Aunt Elizabeth died a long time ago, remember?" But Carol didn't hear her, lost in distant memories. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother wither away. If only she had managed to warn the businessman about the fake doctor. Maybe he could have helped her mother in return. At the Campbell mansion, the situation was not much different. Arthur was getting worse every day, and the tension in the house was palpable. Michelle spent sleepless nights, alternating between taking care of her husband and making desperate calls to renowned doctors in search of a second opinion. Eleanor, forbidden to leave her room except for meals, spent hours sitting on her balcony, thinking about the poor girl who had tried to warn them. Isabella's words echoed in her mind. "He's poisoning people. He did it to my mother." The rich girl watched the security guards making their rounds, noticing how they expelled anyone who approached the gates. Twice she saw Isabella from afar, limping, trying to approach, only to be chased away with threats. One night, while pretending to sleep, Eleanor overheard a conversation between her mother and Dr. Richards in the hallway. "I don't understand why he's not responding to the treatment," said the doctor, his voice smooth and professional. "Perhaps we need to increase the dose." "Do whatever is necessary, doctor," replied Michelle, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I can't lose him. Don't worry, Mrs. Campbell. I'm sure we'll see significant results soon." There was something in the doctor's tone that made Eleanor shiver. She remembered again Isabella's desperate words. What if she was telling the truth? The next morning, while having breakfast in the kitchen, Eleanor overheard two maids talking in low voices. "Did you see how the boss got worse after he started taking the new medicines?" one of them whispered. "I did, and that's not all. My cousin works at the hospital, and she told me that more people are getting sick after consulting with that doctor. They say a lady even died last week." Eleanor felt her heart race. She needed to do something, but what? She was just a 6-year-old girl, and no one took her seriously. Her mother treated her like a silly child, and the employees had strict orders not to let her leave the house. It was then that she had an idea. Mary, the housekeeper who had taken care of her since she was a baby, was the only person in the house she really trusted. That afternoon, while Michelle was busy with an important call, Eleanor looked for Mary in her room in the back of the house. "Mary, I need your help," she said, closing the door behind her. "It's about that poor girl who tried to talk to us." The housekeeper sighed, sitting on the small bed. "Eleanor, your mother forbade anyone from talking about it. Please, Mary, it's important. I think she was telling the truth about the doctor. I heard things, bad things about him, and Daddy only gets worse." Mary observed the anguished face of the girl she had practically raised. She knew that expression. It was the same one Eleanor made when she knew something important and needed to be heard. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked. "I need to find that girl again. She said the doctor did something to her mother, too. If we can prove he's hurting people. It's too dangerous, sweetie. Your mother would kill me if she knew. Please, Mary, Daddy might die. You also saw how he got worse, didn't you?" The housekeeper was silent for a long moment, thoughtful. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll help you find the girl, but we need to be very careful." That night, after everyone was asleep, Mary quietly left the mansion. She knew the streets of the city and knew where the homeless people usually took refuge. For hours, she walked through alleys and underpasses, asking about a girl named Isabella, who had a sick mother. Finally, almost at dawn, a lady who sold candies at a traffic light gave her some information. "I know her. They live in a shack near the old textile factory. The mother is very sick, poor thing. I saw the girl yesterday trying to get money for medicine." Mary followed the directions and found the shack. Her heart ached when she saw the conditions of the place. How could anyone live like that? She approached slowly and heard a soft cry coming from inside. "Isabella," she called gently. "Isabella, are you there?" The crying stopped, and after a few seconds, the precarious door opened. Isabella appeared, her face stained with tears and dirt. Seeing the housekeeper, her eyes widened in recognition. She had seen her a few times at the mansion. "I came because Eleanor wants to talk to you," Mary said gently. "She believes what you said about the doctor." Isabella shook her head, more tears streaming down. "I can't leave now. My mother, she's very sick. I can't even lift her to drink water." Mary peeked inside the shack and saw Carol lying on the dirty mattress, her breathing irregular and difficult. The scene broke her heart. "Come with me," she said, making a decision. "I'm going to take you both to a better place. Your mother needs urgent medical care, but we don't have money. Don't worry about that now. I'm going to help you. But in return, I need you to tell me everything you know about this doctor. Every detail can be important to saving Mr. Campbell." Isabella looked at her mother, then at Mary, hope fighting against fear in her eyes. Finally, she nodded. What none of them knew was that, at that very moment, Arthur was having a sudden worsening at the mansion. Michelle, desperate, had called Dr. Richards for an emergency visit. And the doctor, realizing that his plan could be discovered, was about to take drastic measures. Mary didn't have her own car, so she had to call a taxi. The driver hesitated when he saw Carol's condition, but a few extra bills convinced him to help. With great effort, they managed to carry the unconscious woman to the vehicle. Throughout the journey, Isabella held her mother's hand, praying softly. "Where are we going?" she asked, noticing that they were not heading towards the Campbell mansion. "To my sister's house," Mary replied. "She's a nurse practitioner and lives near the hospital where she works. She'll know what to do." When they arrived, Kathy, Mary's sister, was already waiting at the door. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and calloused hands from working so much. Seeing Carol's condition, she immediately took command of the situation. "Put her on the bed in the back room," she instructed, quickly preparing some basic equipment she kept at home. "Mary, I need you to get some medicine at the pharmacy. I'll make a list." As Mary hurried out, Kathy began to examine Carol. Her face became more worried every minute. "How long has your mother been like this?" she asked Isabella, who was watching everything from the corner of the room, hugging her knees. "She's been sick for a long time," the girl replied. "But it got worse after she took the medicine that doctor gave her." "What doctor?" "Dr. Richards. He said he was going to cure her, but the medicines only hurt her, just like he's doing to Eleanor's father." Kathy stopped what she was doing and stared at Isabella. "Dr. Richards Mendez," the girl nodded. "Do you know him?" "Unfortunately, yes," Kathy replied, her voice filled with concern. "There was a patient in the hospital last week. She died after taking the medicine he prescribed. We suspect there's something wrong with these medicines, but he's very influential. No one can prove anything." At that moment, Carol had a violent spasm, her body arching on the bed. Kathy rushed to help her, shouting instructions for Isabella to fetch clean towels and water. At the Campbell mansion, the situation was not much different. Arthur had worsened drastically overnight, and Michelle was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Dr. Richards had just arrived and was examining the patient with a calmness that bordered on carelessness. "I don't understand," Michelle said, pacing back and forth. "He was getting better yesterday." "These are the normal ups and downs of treatment, Mrs. Campbell," replied the doctor, preparing a syringe. "I'm going to apply a stronger medication that should stabilize him." Eleanor, who was watching everything hidden by the crack in the door, felt a shiver when she saw the syringe. There was something wrong with the way the doctor smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. The girl ran to Mary's room, but found only the neatly made and empty bed. Where was the housekeeper? Had she managed to find Isabella? Back at Kathy's house, Mary was returning with the medicines when she noticed a dark car parked across the street. There were two men inside it, watching the house. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized one of them. It was Dr. Richards' driver. She entered quickly and told her sister what she saw. Kathy paled. "We need to get them out of here," she said quietly. "If he finds out we're helping, it could be dangerous." "But where to?" Mary asked. "Mrs. Campbell won't let them stay at the mansion." "The hospital," Kathy replied after a moment of reflection. "I can admit her as an emergency patient. There, at least, she'll have basic care, and it'll be harder for him to do anything with so many witnesses around." But before they could do anything, they heard loud knocks on the door. The two women exchanged startled glances. "Police!" a voice shouted from outside. "Open the door!" Isabella, who had just changed the compresses on her mother's forehead, ran into the room in a panic. Kathy followed her, closing the door silently behind her. "It's not the real police," she whispered. "I know the voice. It's one of Dr. Richards's henchmen. He often uses them to intimidate people." The knocking continued, louder and louder. Mary looked out the back window and saw that there was another car blocking the exit. "We're surrounded," she said, the fear evident in her voice. Carol chose this moment to have another coughing fit, a sound so loud that it would certainly be heard from outside. Kathy rushed to help her, trying to muffle the sound with a pillow. "Please don't let them take my mother," Isabella pleaded, clutching Mary's skirt. "He'll hurt her again." The knocking on the door suddenly stopped, replaced by the sound of something being forced. They were trying to break down the entrance. "The basement," Kathy whispered suddenly. "There's a passage that leads to the neighbor's house. We used it when we were kids." Quickly, but very carefully so as not to make noise, they began to move. Carol, the woman, was unconscious, which made the work even more difficult. Isabella helped as best she could, her small body trembling with fear and effort. The sound of the door being broken down echoed through the house, just as they managed to close the basement hatch. In the dark, they could hear heavy footsteps. Upstairs, furniture being knocked over, men shouting orders. "They have to be here somewhere," a voice thundered. "The hospital car is in the garage. The nurse didn't go to work today. Search everything." In the basement, Kathy guided the group through a narrow, damp tunnel. Mary carried Carol with her sister's help, while Isabella came right behind, holding onto the hem of Kathy's dress so as not to get lost in the dark. "How much further?" Mary whispered, already out of breath. "Just a little more," Kathy replied. "Mr. Smith, the neighbor, should be home. He'll help us." At that moment, they heard voices coming from the basement. They had discovered the hatch. "Quick!" Kathy whispered, hurrying as much as possible in the tight space. Finally, they reached a wooden ladder that led to another hatch. Kathy climbed up first and knocked 3 times on the wood. A code combined from childhood times. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, the hatch opened, revealing the worried face of an elderly gentleman. "Kathy, what's going on?" he asked, helping them climb up. "I'll explain later, Mr. Smith. Now we need help to take this woman to the hospital, and fast." The old man asked no more questions. He helped carry Carol to his garage, where an old car was parked. "Go through the back entrance of the hospital," Kathy instructed, helping to settle Carol in the back seat. "I'll go in through the front and meet you there. If anyone asks, say you're relatives of mine." "What about you?" Mary asked, worried. "I'll go back to the house and try to distract them. They can't suspect that we helped in the escape." Before they could protest, Kathy had already disappeared into the tunnel. Mary took the wheel, with Isabella squeezed between her and Mr. Smith. As they drove away, they could hear shouts coming from Kathy's house. What none of them knew was that at that very moment, Dr. Richards was preparing to administer a lethal dose of medication to Arthur Campbell. His expression was one of absolute calm as he filled the syringe with the liquid that he knew very well would end his patient's life for good. Eleanor, still hidden, watched everything with wide eyes of fear. Somehow she knew she needed to prevent that injection, but how? She was just a 6-year-old girl, and no one took her seriously. Mr. Smith's car moved through the dark city, deviating from the main streets to avoid being noticed. In the back seat, Carol breathed with increasing difficulty, her skin burning with fever. Isabella held her mother's hand, fighting back tears as she watched the pale, sweaty face of the only person she had in the world. "Hang in there, Mom," she whispered. "We're almost there." Mary drove as fast as she dared, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. Mr. Smith's old car roared and shook, making Carol moan with every bump. Meanwhile, at the Campbell mansion, Eleanor felt her heart beating so hard that she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Dr. Richards approached her father's bed with the syringe, a gentle smile on his lips that didn't match the coldness in his eyes. "This dose will help him rest," he said to Michelle, who watched anxiously. Eleanor could no longer wait. In a desperate impulse, she ran into the room and tripped on purpose, knocking over the cart with the medical instruments. The noise was deafening, metal trays hitting the floor, glass breaking, instruments scattering everywhere. "Eleanor!" Michelle shouted, horrified. "What do you think you're doing?" "Sorry, Mom. I just wanted to see Daddy," she whined, but her eyes were fixed on the syringe that the doctor had dropped in fright. "Get this girl out of here," ordered Dr. Richards, his mask of calm slipping for a moment to reveal an expression of pure anger. "No!" Eleanor shouted, clinging to her father's bed rail. "He's going to hurt Daddy. Isabella said he hurts people." "Enough of this nonsense." Michelle tried to pry her daughter's fingers from the rail. Mary, come get Eleanor." But Mary didn't answer the call, because at that moment she was entering the back of the hospital with Carol and Isabella. Kathy was already waiting for them, having managed to shake off Dr. Richards' men. "Quickly this way," she instructed, guiding them through less crowded corridors. "I managed to get a spot in the north wing, where I work. We'll say she's a cousin." As they helped put Carol on the stretcher, Isabella noticed that her mother was cold despite the fever. "Aunt Kathy," she called, her voice small and scared. "My mother is very quiet." Kathy quickly checked Carol's vital signs and her face turned serious. We need to hurry. Mary, take Isabella to the waiting room. Mr. Smith, please, stay with them. No, Isabella protested. I want to stay with my mother. Honey, we need to take care of her now. I promise that as soon as I can, I'll come get you, Kathy said, already pushing the stretcher through the corridors with the help of other nurses. At the mansion, the confusion continued. Eleanor had managed to break free from her mother and was now running around the room, knocking over everything she could to prevent the doctor from approaching her father. This girl is completely out of control, Dr. Richards exclaimed, his face red with anger. Mrs. Campbell, if you can't control her, I'll have to postpone the medication, and I guarantee your husband doesn't have much time. No! Eleanor shouted. He's lying, Mom. He wants to hurt Daddy just like he hurt Isabella's mother. Michelle, torn between irritation with her daughter and a seed of doubt that was beginning to grow, didn't know how to act. It was then that she noticed something strange. Where was Mary? The housekeeper always came immediately when called. Where is Mary? She asked, more to herself than to the others. Mary went out, replied one of the maids who had arrived, attracted by the confusion. A few hours ago, she said it was an emergency. Michelle frowned. Mary never left without warning, especially during her shift. And now that she thought about it, the housekeeper had acted strangely in recent days, always whispering with Eleanor in the corners. At the hospital, Isabella refused to stay in the waiting room. Taking advantage of a moment of distraction from Mary and Mr. Smith, she slipped through the corridors, following the direction where they had taken her mother. After a few wrong turns, she found the north wing. Hidden behind a cleaning cart, she saw Kathy running out of one of the rooms, shouting for help. "Cardiac arrest!" she shouted. "We need the defibrillator now!" Isabella's heart stopped. It was the room where they had taken her mother. Her legs buckled, and she slipped to the floor, sobbing softly as she heard the rush of doctors and nurses. Back at the mansion, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Dr. Richards had regained his composure and was trying to convince Michelle. "Mrs. Campbell, your daughter is obviously disturbed by her father's illness. It's understandable, but we can't allow this to interfere with the treatment. Every minute we lose is precious." Michelle looked at Eleanor, who still clung to her father's bed with all the strength her small body allowed. There was something different about her daughter. It wasn't a simple child's tantrum. Eleanor had always been a sensible girl, even so young. "Daughter," she called, lowering herself to be at the girl's eye level, "why are you so sure that the doctor wants to hurt your father?" "Because Isabella said so. She tried to warn us, but no one wanted to listen. Her mother got just like Daddy after taking his medicine. And where is this Isabella now?" Michelle asked, remembering the dirty girl who had kicked out days ago. "Mary went to get her. She said she was going to bring her back to tell everything." Dr. Richards let out a forced laugh. "Mrs. Campbell, don't tell me you're going to listen to a child who clearly made up a story based on what she heard from some beggar." But Michelle was no longer listening. Pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind. Mary's absence, Eleanor's strange behavior, and above all, Arthur's constant worsening since he began treatment with that doctor. "Doctor," she said, standing up and straightening her posture, "I think it's best if we postpone this medication until—" She didn't finish the sentence. A sound of glass breaking interrupted her. One of the maids had dropped a glass of water, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the liquid. From the syringe that Dr. Richards was holding, a few drops had fallen on the floor when he was startled by the noise. Where the liquid touched the marble floor, a dark stain formed instantly. "What kind of medicine stains marble like that, doctor?" Michelle asked, her voice trembling with contained rage. The doctor's face changed. The professional smile disappeared, giving way to a hard, cold expression. Without saying a word, he turned and began to walk quickly towards the door. "Security!" Michelle shouted, "Don't let that man leave!" At the hospital, Isabella remained huddled behind the cleaning cart, her small body shaking with silent sobs. The doctors were still working in her mother's room, the sound of the defibrillator echoing through the hallway every few minutes. "One more time," she heard Kathy's voice commanding. "We're not giving up." Mary finally found her there after searching desperately everywhere. She hugged the girl tightly, letting her cry on her shoulder. "She's going to die like Aunt Elizabeth, isn't she?" Isabella sobbed. "The evil doctor is going to kill her, just like he killed my aunt." Mary froze. "What doctor? What happened to your aunt?" Before Isabella could answer, Kathy came out of the room. Her face was exhausted, but there was a small smile on her lips. "We did it," she said. "It was close, but she's stable now." Isabella raised her head, her red eyes shining with hope. "My mother isn't going to die?" "Not today, honey," Kathy replied, lowering herself beside her. "But we need to find out exactly what medicines she took. Can you tell us everything about this doctor?" At the Campbell mansion, Dr. Richards had been detained by the security guards, but his expression was not that of someone defeated. He maintained a cold smile as Michelle rummaged through his medical bag, finding several unlabeled bottles. "What is this?" she demanded, holding one of the bottles against the light. The liquid inside had a strange, almost metallic coloration. "Experimental medications," he replied calmly. "Perfectly legal, I assure you. I have all the necessary authorizations." "Legal?" Michelle felt her voice rise an octave. "You were testing experimental medications on my husband without telling us?" At that moment, Arthur had another violent coughing fit. His face was getting paler, and now dark spots were beginning to appear on his skin. "He needs to go to the hospital immediately," said one of the maids who had worked as a nursing assistant. "These spots, they're not normal." Michelle wasted no more time arguing. She ordered them to call an ambulance while keeping the doctor under surveillance. Eleanor, still clinging to her father's bed, cried silently. "It's going to be okay, Daddy," she whispered. "Isabella will help us just like we're going to help her." At the hospital, Isabella was sitting on the edge of her mother's bed, watching Carol's now more serene face. The doctors had managed to stabilize her, but her condition was still serious. "So, your Aunt Elizabeth was also a patient of Dr. Richards?" Mary asked gently, sitting in a chair nearby. Isabella nodded, fiddling distractedly with the frayed hem of her dress. "She got sick just like Mom. The doctor said he was going to cure her, but the medicines made her worse. Mom cried a lot when she died. And it was right after she started." "Oh, taking his medicine?" questioned Kathy, who was making notes on a clipboard. "It was just like what happened with Mom. She was already a little sick, but she got much worse after she took his medicine. He said it was a new treatment, that it was going to cure everyone." Mary and Kathy exchanged worried glances. The story was repeating itself. Sick and vulnerable people being used as guinea pigs for some kind of irregular medical experiment. Suddenly, they heard a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, and the sound of a stretcher being pushed hurriedly. "Patient with suspected poisoning," someone shouted. "Needs immediate attention." Kathy ran to the door and paled at what she saw. "It's Mr. Campbell!" she exclaimed. "Mary, they brought him here." Michelle came right behind the stretcher, her face stained with tears and smudged makeup. Eleanor ran alongside her, trying to keep up with the hurried steps of the adults. When they passed the door of the room where they were, Eleanor saw Isabella and stopped abruptly. "Isabella," she shouted, running to hug the girl. "You're back. Now you can tell everyone about the evil doctor." Michelle, who had already passed the room, took a few steps back when she heard her daughter's voice. Her eyes widened at the scene. Eleanor hugging the girl they had kicked out, and on the bed, a woman who seemed on the verge of death. "Mary," she called, recognizing her housekeeper. "What's going on here?" Before Mary could answer, Kathy returned to the room hurriedly. Mrs. Campbell, the doctors are asking for information about the medications your husband was taking. It's urgent. Michelle looked at the bottle she was still holding, one of those she had found in Dr. Richards' bag. Her hands trembled. He was applying this, she said, handing the bottle to Kathy. He said they were experimental medications. Kathy examined the bottle with a grave expression. I'll take it for analysis immediately. But before, she hesitated, looking at Carol in the bed. Do you mind if we compare it with what was given to this girl's mother? The symptoms seem very similar. Michelle looked again at the woman in bed, then at Isabella, and finally at her own daughter, who still clung to her friend as if fearing she might disappear again. Eleanor tried to warn me, she said, her voice choked. She insisted that this girl knew something important, but I didn't want to listen. I was so desperate to see her father get better that... Her voice trailed off. Mary approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, no one is blaming you. This man deceived many people. The important thing now is to prevent him from hurting more people. At that moment, Carol began to stir in the bed. Her eyes opened slowly, and she tried to say something. Mom! Isabella ran to her side, taking her hand. Isabella! Carol's voice was just a whisper. Your aunt, Elizabeth. Don't. Talk now, Mom. Rest! Isabella pleaded, but Carol continued as if needing to say something important. Dr. Richards, Elizabeth discovered his experiments. That's why... She couldn't finish. A coughing fit prevented her from continuing. Kathy quickly adjusted the IV and checked her vital signs. She needs to rest, said the nurse. But I think we just discovered why Dr. Richards was so interested in finding them. Michelle sat heavily in a chair, the realization of what was happening finally hitting her completely. My God, she murmured. How long has this man been doing this? How many people has he already... A shout from the hallway interrupted her. It was one of the security guards from the mansion. He escaped, the man yelled out of breath. Dr. Richards managed to escape. Panic set in the room. If the doctor was loose, no one was safe, and he had already proven that he would do anything to prevent his crimes from being discovered. Michelle hugged Eleanor protectively, while Mary did. The same with Isabella. Carol, semi-conscious in bed, murmured disjointed words about her dead sister. We need to protect these children, Kathy said, her voice firm despite the evident fear, and we need to find out exactly what's in these medicines before it's too late for Mr. Campbell. What no one noticed, in the midst of the confusion, was the shadow that passed by the window of the room, a figure who watched everything with particular interest, especially the two girls embraced, one rich and one poor, united by fate and by a deadly secret that was just beginning to unfold. The hospital laboratory was working at full speed to analyze the medications found in Dr. Richards's bag. Kathy had activated her contacts in the hospital and secured top priority for the tests. Meanwhile, both Arthur and Carol received intensive treatment to try to reverse the effects of the mysterious substances. Michelle didn't leave her husband's side, who had been installed in a private room a few meters from Carol's. Eleanor refused to separate from Isabella, so the two girls spent time between the two rooms, always accompanied by Mary or some security guard. Your mother is going to be okay, Eleanor said, holding her friend's hand as they watched Carol sleep. Aunt Kathy is the best nurse in the hospital. Everyone says so. Isabella tried to smile, but it was difficult. Her mother's interrupted words about Aunt Elizabeth didn't leave her head. What exactly had her aunt discovered about Dr. Richards? In the hallway, Mary was talking in a low voice with Kathy, who had just left the lab. So? Asked the housekeeper, anxious. Did they find anything? Kathy looked around to make sure no one was listening before answering. The preliminary results are frightening, she said. They found traces of experimental substances, things that shouldn't even be tested on humans yet. It seems he was using a combination of drugs that... She stopped speaking abruptly. Carol had begun to stir in the bed, muttering something. The two women rushed into the room. "Elizabeth, the laboratory, the files," said Carol, her eyes still closed but moving rapidly under her eyelids. "In the basement, she kept..." "Mom?" Isabella leaned over the bed. "What files? What laboratory?" But Carol had fallen back into a deep sleep. Kathy checked her vital signs, which fortunately were more stable. "What is she talking about?" asked Mary. "What laboratory could it be?" Isabella bit her lip, thoughtful. "Aunt Elizabeth worked in a lab before she got sick. She was a cleaner there. That's how she met Dr. Richards." "Do you know where that lab was?" Kathy questioned. The girl shook her head negatively. "I only know it was far away. She took 2 buses to get there." "And where did she live? Does her house still exist?" "Yes, it does," replied Isabella. "It's near our shack. After she died, it was closed. No one wanted to live there." Mary and Kathy exchanged meaningful glances. If Elizabeth had discovered something about Dr. Richards' experiments and kept evidence, "We need to go there," Mary said. "It could be our chance to get concrete evidence against him." "It's too risky," Kathy argued. "He's on the loose and probably watching all the places that might have some connection with the case. But if we don't do anything, he might escape. And the more time passes, the harder it gets to prove what he did." Eleanor, who had heard the whole conversation, pulled on Mary's sleeve. "I know how to get there," she said. "Isabella showed me where her shack is once when we were talking. Her aunt's house is nearby." "No!" exclaimed Mary. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. But I can help. No one will suspect a rich child strolling with her nanny. Please." Before Mary could answer, they heard a noise coming from the room next door, where Arthur was hospitalized. The sound of something falling, followed by a scream from Michelle. Kathy rushed there immediately, followed by Mary. When they arrived, they found Michelle in a panic, pointing to the open window. "Someone was there," she shouted. "I saw a shadow. Someone was spying." The security guards immediately began searching the hospital's outdoor area, but found no one. However, on the table next to Arthur's bed, there was something that wasn't there before, a folded piece of paper. Michelle picked up the paper with trembling hands and read aloud, "If you want them to live, keep the children away from Elizabeth's house. Some secrets must remain buried." The silence that followed was deafening. Michelle crumpled the paper in anger. "How dare he threaten our children?" Her voice trembled with fury. "We need to do something." "And we will," said Kathy, taking the crumpled paper. "This is proof that he is desperate. Whatever is in that house must be too important." But we can't risk the girls," argued Mary. "No," agreed Michelle. "The children stay here under protection. I myself am going to that house." "Ma'am, no," protested Mary. "It's too dangerous." "My husband is dying because of this monster," replied Michelle, her voice hard. "I'm not going to stand still waiting for him to claim more victims." At that moment, Carol began to cough violently in the next room. Kathy ran to attend to her, leaving the others still discussing what to do. What no one realized was that during the confusion, Eleanor and Isabella had disappeared. The two girls, moved by a courage that only childhood allows, had decided to take matters into their own hands. "Are you sure you know the way?" whispered Eleanor as they sneaked through the hospital's emergency exit. "I am," replied Isabella, "and I know where Aunt Elizabeth kept the house key too." "Shouldn't we have told someone?" "They weren't going to let us go. Adults always think that children can't do anything important." As the girls walked away from the hospital, they didn't see the dark car that began to follow them slowly. Inside it, Dr. Richards smiled his cold smile as he watched the two small figures through the windshield. "Children are so predictable," he murmured to himself, starting the car, always thinking they can be the heroines of the story. At the hospital, The absence of the girls was only noticed 15 minutes later, when Mary went to bring them a snack. The panic that followed was instant. "My God!" Michelle shouted. "That note, he knew. He knew they were going to try to go there." "We need to find them," Mary said, already running for the exit. "They can't have gone far." But the city streets were a maze, especially for two children alone, and the sun was already beginning to set, turning alleys and lanes into menacing shadows where anything, or anyone, could be hiding. Eleanor had never walked so much in her life. Her feet, accustomed to soft, comfortable shoes, already ached inside the patent leather flats. But she didn't complain, not when she saw Isabella walking barefoot beside her, her calloused feet knowing every stone on the road. "It's this way," Isabella whispered, pulling her friend into a narrow street between two abandoned buildings. "Aunt Elizabeth's house is after that turn." The sun was almost setting, painting the peeling walls with orange shadows that seemed to move like living creatures. The cold wind made the girls shiver in their thin dresses. "Are you sure we're not being followed?" Eleanor asked, for the third time, looking nervously over her shoulder. "I don't think so," Isabella replied, but her voice wasn't as sure as before. "But we better hurry." Elizabeth's house was small and in terrible condition. The windows were boarded up with old planks, and the garden had turned into a small thicket. Isabella went to one of the plants near the door, a withered basil bush that stubbornly clung to life despite the abandonment. "Aunt Elizabeth always kept the key down here," she explained, brushing the dirt away with her hands. "She said no one would look under a dead plant." After a few moments of searching, her fingers found something metallic. The key was rusty, but it still worked. The door opened with a creak that made both girls jump. The interior of the house was dark and dusty. The smell of mold was strong, and cobwebs covered the corners. Furniture covered with sheets looked like silent ghosts watching the intruders. "How are we going to find the files your mother talked about?" Eleanor whispered, grabbing her friend's hand. "In the basement," replied Isabella. "Mom talked about the basement. Aunt Elizabeth spent a lot of time down there. She said it was the safest place in the house." The girls found the basement door in the kitchen. It was locked, but Isabella knew where her aunt kept the key to that door too, inside an old coffee can in the cupboard. The stairs leading down to the basement were steep and the steps creaked dangerously. Eleanor took a small cell phone out of her pocket, a birthday present her mother had recently given her, and used the screen light to illuminate the way. The basement was larger than they expected, divided into several areas by dusty bookshelves. On one wall, there was an old desk with several drawers. On another, boxes and more boxes piled to the ceiling. "Where do we start?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. Before Isabella could answer, they heard a noise coming from upstairs. Footsteps. Someone had entered the house. The girls exchanged panicked glances. Quickly, Isabella pulled Eleanor behind one of the bookshelves, turning off the cell phone light. They stood there, barely breathing, as the footsteps approached the basement door. "I know you're down there," Dr. Richards' voice echoed down the stairs. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to talk." Eleanor began to tremble, but Isabella squeezed her hand tightly. Silently, she indicated a small door on the back wall, probably an emergency exit that her aunt had mentioned once. The doctor's footsteps descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. "You know," he continued, his voice calm and almost gentle, "your Aunt Elizabeth also liked to hide down here. She spent hours organizing her precious files, thinking she was protecting some great secret." The girls began to move silently towards the back door, always keeping in the shadows behind the shelves. "The problem is that she didn't understand that some things are bigger than us. My work, for example. I'm trying to create medicines that can save millions of lives. What are a few casualties in the process compared to that?" Isabella felt a chill when she heard those words. Was that how he saw her aunt? As an acceptable casualty? They reached the back door, but it was locked. Isabella looked around desperately, searching for the key. "There!" Eleanor whispered so quietly that it was barely audible, pointing to a nail on the wall where a rusty key hung. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. Dr. Richards continued to speak, his voice echoing among the shelves. "I don't want to hurt you, children. I just want you to understand that you have to stop interfering. Your parents, well, maybe they can even recover if you cooperate." Isabella grabbed the key, but her hands were shaking so much that she dropped it. The sound of the metal hitting the concrete floor seemed deafening in the silence of the basement. "Ah, there you are." The doctor's voice was much closer now. Eleanor quickly picked up the key from the floor and stuck it in the lock. She turned it once, twice, until she finally heard a click. A bright light illuminated the girls. Dr. Richards had found the switch. He was just a few shelves away, his face pale as wax in the sudden glare. "Don't be foolish," he said, advancing towards them. "There's nowhere to run." But there was. The door opened onto a staircase that led up to the backyard. The girls shot up the stairs, hearing the doctor's footsteps right behind them. "Get back." "Here," he shouted, abandoning his calm tone. "Don't force me to—" His voice was interrupted by a sound of tripping and something heavy falling. When the girls reached the top of the stairs and looked back, they saw that he had tripped on some papers scattered on the floor. Papers that had fallen from an old folder on the nearest shelf, a folder that had been knocked over in the rush. Sheets and more sheets flew through the basement, some landing near the light. Dr. Richards looked at the fallen papers, and his face changed. All the false chivalry disappeared, replaced by an expression of pure hatred. "Elizabeth's notes!" He growled. "You can't." But the girls were already running through the yard, their hearts beating so hard it felt like they were going to explode. Behind them, they could hear the doctor cursing as he tried to gather the papers. "Where are we going?" Eleanor gasped. As they ran. "To the hospital," Isabella replied. "Aunt Kathy will know what to do." What they didn't know was that at that very moment, both Michelle and Mary were arriving at Elizabeth's house, having finally discovered the address, and that Dr. Richards, realizing that he couldn't recover all the papers in time, was making a decision that would change everything. Michelle and Mary arrived at Elizabeth's house just as thick smoke began to pour out of the boarded-up windows. Dr. Richards had set fire to the basement, determined to destroy all evidence of his illegal experiments. "My God!" Michelle shouted when she saw the smoke. "The girls might be inside." Without thinking twice, Mary ran to the front door, which was ajar. Smoke already filled the first floor, making her eyes burn. "Eleanor! Isabella!" she shouted, trying to see through the increasingly dense smoke. "They're not here anymore," a familiar voice sounded behind her. Dr. Richards emerged from the smoke like a ghost, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "They ran away. But it doesn't matter. Everything that could incriminate me will turn to ashes in a few minutes, you monster." Michelle advanced towards him, all her refined education forgotten in the fury of the moment. "How could you do this? How could you use sick people for your experiments?" The doctor laughed, a humorless sound. "You don't understand. My research will revolutionize medicine. Some sacrifices are necessary for progress." "Sacrifices?" Mary's voice trembled with anger. "This girl's sister was a sacrifice? My boss is a sacrifice?" The smoke was getting thicker every second. The fire must have been spreading rapidly in the basement. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Richards said, already heading for the door, "unless you want to become sacrifices too." But when he reached the door, he found his way blocked. Kathy was there, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Dr. Richards." "Mendez," said one of the officers, "you're under arrest." The doctor recoiled, looking around like a cornered animal. Smoke was now coming out of every crack in the house. "You have no proof," he said, coughing. "It's all burning." "No," replied Kathy, a small smile on her lips. "It's not." At that moment, the girls appeared behind her. Eleanor held up her cell phone, the screen showing a video in progress. "We recorded everything you said in the basement," she said, her childish voice filled with triumph. "About Aunt Elizabeth, about the experiments, about the people you hurt." Dr. Richards' face lost all color. He lunged towards the girl, but the police officers were faster, immobilizing him. "And there's more," continued Isabella, taking something out of her dirty dress. It was a thin folder, yellowed with time. Aunt Elizabeth didn't keep everything in the basement. She also hid things in the ceiling of the kitchen. She showed me once, said it was a secret just for us. The folder contained dozens of detailed notes about Dr. Richards' experiments, including patient names, dates, and results. Elizabeth had documented everything meticulously before becoming another victim. "The firefighters are coming," Kathy announced, hearing the sirens in the distance. "We're going to take everyone to the hospital. The girls need to be examined because of the smoke, and we have to check if these documents can help in the treatment of Mr. Campbell and Carol." As Dr. Richards was led away by the police, cursing and struggling, Michelle hugged her daughter tightly. "Forgive me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have believed you from the beginning." "It's okay, Mom," replied Eleanor, returning the hug. "The important thing is that now everyone knows the truth." Mary picked Isabella up, noticing how exhausted the girl seemed. "You were very brave," she said. "Your mother will be proud when she finds out." Isabella rested her head on the housekeeper's shoulder, finally allowing some tears to escape. "Will she be okay now?" "Yes," replied Kathy, who was quickly examining Elizabeth's notes. "Now that we know exactly what was used, we can treat both her and Mr. Campbell correctly." The firefighters arrived and began to fight the fire, which had fortunately been contained to the basement. Elizabeth's house, although damaged, remained standing, as if she herself, even after death, had protected the evidence that would finally bring justice. On the way back to the hospital, Eleanor and Isabella slept in the back seat of the car, their little hands intertwined. Michelle, who was driving, looked at them through the rearview mirror from time to time. "It's amazing," she commented softly, "how two children managed to do what we adults couldn't." "Sometimes we need the innocence of a child to see the truth," replied Mary. "They don't have our prejudices, our limitations." Kathy, in the passenger seat, continued to study Elizabeth's notes. "There's something here," she said suddenly. "Something about an antidote that she was developing secretly. It seems she discovered a way to reverse the effects of Dr. Richards' experiments." "And did she manage to finish it?" asked Michelle, her voice betraying the hope she was trying to contain. "I don't know yet," replied Kathy, "but she left detailed notes. With the help of the hospital's doctors, maybe we can—" Her voice was interrupted by a cell phone ring. It was from the hospital. "Hello? Yes, it's me. What?" Her face paled. "We're on our way. Don't let anyone enter their rooms until we get there." "What happened?" asked Michelle, feeling her heart clench. "Someone tried to enter the rooms of Mr. Campbell and Carol," replied Kathy, "and left something, a bottle with a dark liquid. There was a note with it." "What did the note say?" Kathy hesitated before answering. It said, "It's not over. Some secrets need to die with their guardians." In the back seat, Isabella stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about her aunt. Eleanor squeezed her hand unconsciously, as if even sleeping she knew that her friend needed comfort. Michelle stepped on the accelerator. The night wasn't over yet, and something told her that Dr. Richards wasn't the only one involved in that sinister story of illegal experiments and mysterious deaths. When they arrived at the hospital, they found a real security operation set up. Extra guards had been positioned in every corridor, and no one entered or left without identification. The mysterious bottle had been isolated and was being analyzed, with maximum urgency, in the laboratory. "How could this have happened?" questioned Michelle, furious. "Dr. Richards is in prison. How did someone manage to get in here?" "It must have been before his arrest," replied one of the security guards. The cameras show a person in a white coat, but their face was always turned down. They seemed to know the hospital's routine well. Kathy frowned, a suspicion beginning to form in her mind. "Can I see the footage?" While the adults argued, Eleanor and Isabella, who had woken up with the commotion, slipped into the room where Carol was hospitalized. The woman was awake, although still very weak. "Mom!" Isabella ran to hug her. "You're not going to believe what happened. We found Aunt Elizabeth's papers, the ones she was keeping, and the evil doctor was arrested." Carol tried to smile, but there was concern in her eyes. "Daughter, you shouldn't have. It's dangerous." "But we did it, Mom," Isabella insisted. "Now they'll be able to make you better." Eleanor, who was watching the scene from the door, noticed something strange. There was a nurse standing in the hallway, staring into the room. Something about her posture seemed wrong. "Isabella," she called softly, "come here for a minute." When her friend approached, Eleanor pointed discreetly to the nurse. "Do you know her? Have you seen her taking care of your mother before?" Isabella looked and frowned. "No. And she's wearing the wrong coat. Aunt Kathy said that each wing has a different color scrub. That nurse is wearing the pediatric wing scrubs, but this is the intensive care unit." The girls exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. Slowly, they began to move away from the door. The nurse noticed the movement and took a step towards them. Her face, partially covered by a surgical mask, showed no expression. "We need to call Aunt Kathy," whispered Eleanor. "It'll take her too long," Isabella replied in the same tone. "We have to do something now." The nurse was getting closer and closer. Through the mask, the girls could see her eyes. Cold, calculating. Eyes that were very reminiscent of Dr. Richards's. It was Carol who saved the situation. Even weak, she sensed the danger. "Help!" she screamed with all the strength she could muster. "There's a strange person here!" The nurse stopped for a moment, surprised by the scream. It was enough for the girls to run out of the room, bumping into a table and knocking over some equipment. The noise attracted the attention of the security guards, who came running. The fake nurse, seeing herself surrounded, pulled something out of her pocket, a syringe filled with a dark liquid. "Don't come near me," she threatened, her voice revealing that it was, in fact, a man. "Or you'll find out exactly what this liquid does." "I know that voice," said Kathy, who had arrived running with Michelle and Mary. "It's Dr. Richards' assistant. He participated in the experiments." The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Participated? I created many of them. Richards was just the face of the operation. I was the brain, and you won't ruin years of research because of two nosy brats." He lunged towards the girls, but tripped over the fallen equipment. The syringe flew from his hand, and he lost his balance. It was all very quick. The security guards took advantage of the moment to subdue him, while Kathy kicked the syringe away, preventing it from breaking. "More evidence," she said, picking up the syringe carefully. "And this time, we caught the chemist responsible for the formula." The man struggled, shouting threats and curses as he was led away by the guards. The girls hugged each other, trembling but relieved. "How did you know?" asked Michelle, embracing the two. "We didn't know," replied Eleanor. "But Isabella noticed. The coat was wrong," completed Isabella. "Aunt Kathy always talks about the colors of the coats." Kathy smiled, proud. "And they say children don't pay attention to what we say." Mary, who had gone to check on Carol, returned with encouraging news. "She's fine, just scared. And look, the dark spots on her skin, the ones that appeared because of the poison. They seem to be disappearing." Everyone rushed to see. It was true. Carol's skin, which had previously been covered in purplish spots, was beginning to return to normal. "But how," asked Michelle, hopeful, "is the same thing happening to Arthur?" Kathy examined Carol quickly, then ran to check on Arthur. When she returned, she was smiling. "Elizabeth's notes!" she exclaimed. "The antidote she was developing, she must have managed to finish it, and she left clues in the documents, clues that only someone who knew her could understand." "What do you mean?" everyone asked at the same time. "The last pages looked like tea recipes," Kathy explained, "but they weren't ordinary teas. They were codes. Elizabeth was very smart. She transformed the antidote formula into seemingly innocent recipes. The lab started producing the antidote as soon as we deciphered the notes, and it was already administering it to the patients when that man tried to attack." Michelle began to cry with relief. "So, they're going to be okay? They're really going to recover?" "It's going to take a while," replied Kathy. "But yes, I believe they will recover completely." Isabella climbed onto the bed and hugged her mother carefully. Carol was still weak, but managed to raise her arms to embrace her daughter. "You saved us, daughter," she whispered. "You and your little friend, you saved us all." "Aunt Elizabeth helped," replied Isabella. "She left everything explained. We just needed to find it." Eleanor joined the hug, and soon Michelle did too. Mary and Kathy watched the scene with tears in their eyes. "You know," said Kathy softly, "they say that love is the best medicine. I think in this case it was the love of a sister for another, of a mother for her daughter, and of two girls, who became unlikely friends. But there was still one question that no one had asked. Why had Dr. Richards and his assistant specifically chosen Arthur for their experiments? What made the businessman such an important target? The answer to that question would change the lives of everyone involved even further. The next morning, the hospital was calmer. Carol and Arthur were responding well to the antidote, although they still needed a lot of rest. The girls had finally been convinced to sleep a little, sharing a sofa bed in Carol's room, while Michelle rested in an armchair next to her husband's bed. Mary was changing Carol's IV when Kathy entered the room, carrying a thick folder. Her face was serious. "We need to talk," she said in a low voice so as not to wake the girls. "I found something in Elizabeth's notes, something that explains a lot." Carol, who was awake, tried to sit up in bed. "Is it about Richards? About why he chose us?" Kathy nodded. "In part. Actually, it's about Mr. Campbell, and about you too, Carol." Mary frowned. "What do you mean?" "Elizabeth discovered that Dr. Richards didn't choose his victims randomly," Kathy explained, opening the folder. "He looked for people with a specific genetic condition, something in their blood that reacted uniquely to the experimental medications." "And what does that have to do with Mr. Campbell and Carol?" asked Mary. Kathy hesitated before continuing. "According to Elizabeth's notes, this condition is hereditary, and both Carol and Mr. Campbell have exactly the same blood type, with the same unique characteristics." Carol felt her heart race. "What are you trying to say?" "Elizabeth discovered..." Kathy took a deep breath. "She discovered that Mr. Campbell is your father." "Carol!" The silence that followed was deafening. Carol put her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "No, it can't be," she murmured. "My mother never..." "Your mother worked at the Campbell mansion a long time ago, didn't she?" Kathy asked gently. "As a maid?" Carol nodded slowly. "Yes, but that was before I was born. She left there when she found out she was pregnant. She never wanted to." "Talk about my father." "The dates match," said Kathy, showing some notes. "Elizabeth investigated all of this when she began to suspect Dr. Richards's experiments. She realized that it was no coincidence that he had chosen the two of you." Mary, who had sat down with the impact of the revelation, suddenly understood. Something That's why Dr. Richards was so interested in both of them. He needed people with this specific genetic condition for his experiments, and he found father and daughter without them knowing the connection between them. At that moment, a small noise caught everyone's attention. Eleanor was awake, sitting on the sofa bed, her wide eyes fixed on Isabella, who was still sleeping. "So," she whispered, "Isabella is my sister?" Kathy gestured for her to speak, more quietly. "Half-sister technically, but yes, you have the same father." Eleanor looked at her sleeping friend with an expression of pure amazement. Suddenly, a lot made sense. Why she had felt such a strong connection with Isabella from the beginning, why they had managed to work so well together, why her heart ached so much when she saw the other girls suffering. "We need to tell Mr. Campbell," said Mary. "He has the right to know." "I already know," a weak voice sounded from the door. Michelle was there, pale but composed. "I just told him." Everyone turned to her, expecting an outburst of anger or indignation, but Michelle just seemed tired and a little sad. "How did he react?" asked Carol, fearing the answer. He cried," replied Michelle, entering the room and closing the door. "He said he always wondered. Your mother, Elizabeth, she left so suddenly, without explanation. He tried to look for her, but she had left the city." "My mother never wanted him to know," said Carol, tears streaming down her face. "She said he was an important man, that he had an established life, that we couldn't disrupt it." Michelle approached Carol's bed, her eyes soft. "She was trying to protect you. And him. But now we have the chance to fix this." "What do you mean?" asked Carol, confused by the surprisingly gentle reaction of Arthur's wife. "My husband wants to meet you, really meet you as his daughter, and he wants Isabella to be part of our lives too." At that moment, as if she had heard her name, Isabella began to stir on the couch. Everyone held their breath as she opened her eyes slowly. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing the strange silence in the room. "Did something happen?" Eleanor couldn't contain herself. She jumped off the couch and hugged Isabella tightly. "You're my sister," she exclaimed, tears of joy in her eyes. "My real little sister." Isabella was paralyzed for a moment, trying to process what she had just heard. She looked at her mother, then at Michelle, then at Kathy, seeking confirmation. "It's true," said Carol softly. "Eleanor's father, Mr. Campbell, he's your father too." Isabella's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, fear, and finally a kind of wondrous understanding. "That's why we got along so well from the beginning," she said, hugging Eleanor back. "That's why I felt I needed to help when I saw him sick." Michelle approached the girls, kneeling beside the sofa. "You two saved his life," she said. Your father. And now, if you want, we can be a family. All of us." But there was something on Carol's face that still showed concern. As if she knew that, even with this seemingly happy ending, there were still more revelations to come. Because among Elizabeth's notes, buried between codes and formulas, there was one more secret, one that would explain why Dr. Richards had gone so far in his obsession with that specific family. Kathy spent the night studying the rest of Elizabeth's notes, trying to decipher the last codes hidden in the tea recipes. There was something in the subtext, vague references to an original project that preceded Dr. Richards's experiments. The next morning, while the girls were having breakfast in Carol's room, Kathy asked to speak with Michelle in private. "I found something," she said, showing a yellowed page from the notes. "Something about your husband's family, about his father." Michelle frowned. "Arthur's father died a long time ago, even before we got married. He never talked much about it. According to Elizabeth's notes, he was also a doctor, and he worked with genetic experiments in the same laboratory where Dr. Richards began his career." "What do you mean?" "The father-in-law I knew was a businessman, like Arthur. He changed professions after an incident at the laboratory, Kathy explained. Elizabeth discovered that he was developing research on rare genetic mutations, and he found something unique in his own blood. Michelle sat down slowly, feeling that she was about to hear something that would change everything. He discovered that he had a mutation that made his blood especially resistant to certain diseases, Kathy continued. A mutation that passed onto his son, Arthur, and consequently to Carol and Isabella. And what does that have to do with Dr. Richards? He was Arthur's father's assistant at the time. When the laboratory closed after the incident, he stole the research and spent years trying to recreate the experiments. But he needed people with the same genetic mutation. That's why he looked for Arthur, Michelle murmured, understanding. And somehow he found out about Carol. Elizabeth found old records that showed that Dr. Richards kept the laboratory under surveillance. He saw when Elizabeth, Carol's mother, started working there as a cleaner. He saw when she and Arthur, and he waited all these years, planning his revenge. It wasn't revenge, Kathy corrected. It was obsession. He needed to prove that he could complete the work that Arthur's father abandoned. He wanted to create a revolutionary medication using their special blood. At that moment, they heard a noise coming from Arthur's room. They ran there and found him sitting on the bed, more awake and lucid than in recent days. "I remember," he said as soon as he saw them. "I remember my father talking about the experiments. He said he had discovered something important in our blood, something that could help many people. But then there was an accident." "What kind of accident?" asked Michelle softly. "One of the patients died during a test. My father was devastated, destroyed all the research and closed the laboratory. He never talked about it again. He started from scratch as a businessman, saying he wanted to do something that couldn't hurt anyone. But Dr. Richards didn't give up," said Kathy. "He continued using increasingly dangerous and unethical methods." "And now," asked Michelle, "what happens now that we know all this?" "Now," replied Kathy, "we need to find out if there's anyone else involved." Elizabeth's latest notes mention a council that funded Dr. Richards's research, powerful people who wanted to profit from the miracle drug he promised to create. In the next room, oblivious to this conversation, Eleanor and Isabella were playing with some dolls that Michelle had brought from home. Carol watched them with a tired smile, still processing all the changes in her life. "So, are we going to live in the mansion?" asked Isabella for the third time, still not believing it. "Yes, honey," replied Carol. Your father insisted. He said he wants to make up for all the years he missed. And you'll have your own room," added Eleanor, excited. "Next to mine. We can make a door between the two rooms, can't we, Mom?" Michelle, who had returned to the room, smiled at her. Daughter's enthusiasm. "We'll see about that later, honey. First, we need to take care of everyone getting better." But there was a shadow in her eyes that Carol noticed immediately. "Did something happen?" she asked when the girls turned their attention back to the dolls. Michelle hesitated, looking at Kathy for guidance. The nurse nodded slightly. "We discovered more things about Dr. Richards," Michelle said in a low voice. "About why he chose our family, and it seems he wasn't acting alone." Carol felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "There were other people involved, important people with money and influence, and we don't know if they will try to continue his work." The room fell silent except for the whispers of the girls playing. The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. "What are we going to do?" Carol asked finally. "First, we're going to take care of you," Kathy replied firmly. "After you're recovered and safe at home, we can think about the next step." "And Elizabeth's notes?" asked Mary, who had followed the conversation in silence. "Shouldn't we hand everything over to the police?" "We've already made backup copies," said Kathy, "but we need to be careful. We don't know how high this will go." At that moment, Isabella approached the bed, holding something in her hand. It was a sheet of paper that had fallen from one of the dolls, an old doll that Michelle had brought from Eleanor's room. "Look what I found, Mom," she said, handing the paper to Carol. Everyone leaned in to see. It was an old photo, yellowed with time. It showed a group of people in front of a laboratory. In the front row, there was a man who looked a lot like Arthur, only older. Next to him, a young Dr. Richards. And behind them, partially visible, was a woman who made Carol's heart stop. "My mother," she whispered. "But this was before she worked at the mansion. How?" Kathy took the photo with trembling hands. "This changes everything," she said. "Your mother didn't start working for the Campbells by chance, Carol. She already knew the family. She was part of the original project." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made everyone turn around. Arthur was at the door, leaning on a cane, but standing. "We need to talk," he said, his face serious. "About your mother, Carol, and about what really happened in that laboratory 25 years ago." Michelle quickly brought a chair for Arthur, who sat down with difficulty next to Carol's bed. The girls, realizing the seriousness of the moment, stopped playing and sat quietly on the sofa bed. "Your mother," began Arthur, looking directly at Carol, "wasn't just a cleaner. Elizabeth was a brilliant scientist who worked undercover in my father's laboratory." Carol felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "What do you mean? My mother barely knew how to read." "That's what she wanted everyone to think," continued Arthur. "In fact, she had a doctorate in genetics. She was investigating some suspicious practices in the laboratory, practices that my father was unaware of." Michelle held her husband's hand, encouraging him to continue. Arthur took a deep breath before proceeding. "Dr. Richards wasn't just an assistant. He was diverting resources and doing unauthorized experiments with patients. Your mother discovered it and alerted my father. That's why the laboratory was closed. But then why did she continue working as a maid in the mansion?" asked Carol, trying to process everything. "To protect me," replied Arthur softly. "She knew that Richards hadn't given up, that he would continue looking for people with our special genetic condition, so she stayed around watching, making sure he didn't get close. And that's when you two—" Carol couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes." Arthur lowered his eyes. "We fell in love. But she knew we couldn't be together, not while Richards was still out there. So when she found out she was pregnant, she ran away," completed Carol, "to protect me too." Kathy, who had been examining the photo more closely, suddenly exclaimed, "There's something written on the back," she said, carefully turning the aged paper over. It was a series of numbers and letters, seemingly meaningless, but Arthur paled when he saw it. "It's the code for the safe," he murmured, "for the laboratory's secret safe, where my father kept the most important documents." "But wasn't the laboratory closed?" asked Michelle. "It was, but the building is still there, abandoned, and if the safe was never opened after my father closed it—" "There may be evidence," exclaimed Kathy, "evidence that could incriminate not only Richards, but everyone involved. Carol's mother must have written this on the photo before fleeing," said Mary, "as a guarantee, an insurance policy. And the photo stayed all these years hidden in an old doll," completed Michelle, shaking her head in amazement. At that moment, they heard a commotion in the hallway. One of the security guards entered. News was like an icy wave passing through the room. Michelle instinctively hugged Eleanor, while Carol pulled Isabella closer. "How?" asked Kathy. "He left a note," replied the guard, "saying that others will continue the work, and it had a list of names." "Names of who?" asked Arthur, although his tone suggested that he already knew the answer. "Businessmen, politicians, doctors, powerful people who were funding his research, and, sir, your name was on the list as the next target," Panic began to set in, but Arthur remained calm. "We need to act fast," he said. "That's safe. If my mother kept the original evidence there, we can expose them all before they try anything." "But you can barely walk," protested Michelle, "and it's too dangerous." "We have no choice," he replied. "Now that Richards is dead, they'll try to erase all the evidence, and we are living evidence." Carol tried to get out of bed. "I'll go with you." "No," said Arthur firmly. "You're still weak, and the girls need you here." "I'll go," offered Kathy. "I know the building. I used to pass by it on the way to work, and I can take some security guards from the hospital." "I'm going too," said Michelle, surprising everyone. "I'm not going to stand here waiting while my husband risks his life." The girls watched the conversation in silence, clinging to each other. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Promise you'll come back, Dad. I just found my sister. I don't want to lose you too." Arthur felt his eyes fill with tears. He opened his arms, and the two girls ran to hug him. "I promise," he said, kissing each one's forehead. "I'll come back and we'll be the family we were always meant to be." While the adults made preparations for the expedition to the abandoned laboratory, Isabella rummaged through the old doll, looking for more clues. That's when her fingers found something sewn into the dress, another paper, even older than the photo. "Look!" she called. "There's more!" Everyone gathered around as she carefully undid the stitches that held the paper. It was a letter, the elegant handwriting already faded by time. "Dear Elizabeth, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. The safe contains more than evidence against Richards. There is something about the genetic mutation that he never knew, something that can change everything. Protect our grandson or granddaughter. They will have the gift. With love, your friend and mother-in-law who could never be, Adelaide Campbell." Arthur let out a sob. It was his mother's handwriting, who had died shortly after the laboratory closed. "She knew," he murmured. "Mom knew about Elizabeth, about the baby. And she kept more secrets in the safe." "What gift was she talking about?" asked Michelle. No one had an answer to that question. But one thing was certain. They needed to get to the laboratory before the others involved in the conspiracy discovered the existence of the safe. What no one realized was that Isabella had discreetly kept a small piece of paper in her pocket, an old receipt that was also hidden in the doll, with an address handwritten on it. An address that she recognized immediately. It was where her grandmother lived before she died, a house that was still closed and untouched. While Arthur, Michelle, and Kathy were preparing to go to the abandoned laboratory, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about the address she had found. Her grandmother, who had passed away just a few months ago, lived in a small house that still hadn't been emptied. Her mother had never had the strength to do so. "Leo," she whispered to her sister when the adults were distracted, "I need to tell you something." Quickly, she showed the paper with the address and explained about her grandmother's house. Eleanor understood immediately what her sister was thinking. "We can't go alone again," she argued. "The last time things almost went completely wrong." "But what if there are more clues there? Grandma knew your grandma. They were friends. There must be something important in her house too." Mary, who was arranging Carol's pillows, noticed the girls whispering. "What are you two plotting?" she asked, knowing that expression on Eleanor's face well. The girls exchanged glances, silently deciding whether they should trust the housekeeper. Finally, Isabella showed the paper. "It's my grandmother's house," she explained. "It's near here, just a few blocks from the hospital." Mary examined the address, thoughtful. The other adults were busy making plans to go to the laboratory, which was on the other side of the city. Isabella's grandmother's house was much closer and, theoretically, would be safer. "I can take you," she said finally, "but we need to tell your mother, Isabella." Carol, who was dozing, woke up when she heard her name. When they explained the situation, she was silent for a moment. "In the last drawer of the dresser," she said finally. "There's a carved wooden box. Your grandmother always said it was for you, Isabella, that one day you would understand." With Carol's permission and the promise to return soon, Mary took the girls to the house. The place was exactly as Isabella remembered. Small but cozy, with a neglected but still beautiful garden. The key was where it always was, under a fern pot. Inside, dust covered the furniture, and the smell of closed house was strong. "The dresser is in her room," said Isabella, guiding the way. The box wasn't hard to find. It was beautiful, made of dark wood with delicate carvings of flowers. Inside, there were old photos, yellowed letters, and at the bottom, a diary. "Look!" exclaimed Eleanor, picking up one of the photos. "It's your grandma with mine!" The photo showed two young and smiling women wearing white coats. On the back it was written, "Elizabeth and Adelaide, more than co-workers, sisters at heart." "They worked together at the laboratory," said Mary, examining other photos. "Your grandmother was also a scientist, Isabella." The diary revealed even more. Isabella's grandmother had been Adelaide Campbell's assistant in the original research on the genetic mutation. Together, they had discovered something extraordinary. "It's not a disease," Mary read aloud. "It's a gift. The special blood, not only fights diseases, it can cure them, but only when there is true love involved. Science alone is not enough." At that moment, Mary's cell phone rang. It was Kathy. "You need to come back now." The nurse's voice was urgent. Arthur took a turn for the worse again. And yet more people are arriving at the hospital, people asking about him and Carol. Mary quickly put the diary in her bag. "Let's go, girls. We need to go back." On the way back to the hospital, Isabella held her grandmother's box tightly against her chest. Something told her that the real answer to everything was there. When they arrived, they found Carol's room in a frenzy. Arthur had had a relapse and was lying on a makeshift bed next to his daughter. Michelle held his hand, crying silently. "The antidote," he murmured, "isn't working anymore." Carol also seemed worse, her breathing more difficult. The dark spots had returned to her skin. "The poison must have mutated," Kathy explained. "It's adapting, getting stronger." Isabella looked at the box in her hands, then at her mother and her newfound father. She remembered the words in the diary. "Only when there is true love involved." Without saying anything, she went to her mother's bed and held her hand. She gestured for Eleanor to do the same with Arthur. "What are you doing?" asked Michelle. "Grandma wrote in the diary," Isabella replied. "It's not the medicine that cures, it's love, and now we're a family." As if responding to her words, something extraordinary began to happen. Where the girls' hands touched their parents, a gentle warmth began to spread. The dark spots on Carol and Arthur's skin began to fade. "Impossible," murmured Kathy, checking vital signs. "They're getting better. The signs are returning to normal." Michelle stared in disbelief at the scene. Mary quickly took the diary out of her bag and began to read more. "The gift passes from generation to generation, but it only manifests through true family love. Adelaide and I discovered this when she saved her son Arthur from a deadly fever just by holding his hand. Richards never understood. He thought it was something that could be synthesized in the laboratory. But it's not science that cures. It's a love." Gradually, Carol and Arthur regained their color. Their breathing normalized, and the fever subsided. When they finally opened their eyes, they found their daughter smiling at them, still holding their hands. "That's why you got better the first time," said Kathy to Carol, "when Isabella was by your side in the hospital, holding your hand. And that's why Arthur improved when Eleanor was around," completed Michelle, understanding. At that moment they heard raised voices in the hallway. The people who were looking for Arthur and Carol had arrived. But it didn't matter now. They had discovered something much more powerful than any threat. "They can come," said Arthur, sitting up in bed with more strength than he had had in days. "They can try whatever they want. Now we're a complete family, and together we are stronger than any scientific experiment." Carol smiled at him, then at Michelle, who returned the smile with tears in her eyes. The girls hugged each other, feeling the power of family love running in their veins, a gift passed through generations, stronger than any disease, more powerful than any evil. In the years that followed, the story of the Campbell family became a legend in the hospital. The case of the illegal experiments was completely exposed, and those involved were arrested. The mansion, which had once seemed so cold and imposing, filled with laughter and love. Isabella and Eleanor grew up inseparable, using their special gift to help others whenever they could. Carol found her place not only as a mother, but as a scientist, following in her own mother's footsteps and helping to develop treatments based not only on science, but also on the power of family love. And on stormy nights, when the girls couldn't sleep, Michelle told the story of two brave scientists, two families separated by fear, and two sisters who, with love and courage, managed to unite everyone again. Because in the end, it wasn't the medicines, the research, or the experiments that saved everyone. It was the love of two girls for their families, a love so strong that it was able to heal not only sick bodies, but also broken hearts, transforming strangers into family and proving that true miracles happen when we open our hearts to each other.